Okay, this is a very important topic, at least very important because I find it very interesting. So I might be biased, but economic development. So here we go. Here we're going to kind of outline what we're going to be going over. First, we're going to look at measures of wealth. So how do we actually define um, what makes a wealthy country? So we're going to go into measures of wealth, and then kind of once we have those, what other measures are there? Then we're going to look at how to create wealth, a really important topic. And finally, the role of technology and capital. And I'm going to kind of move back and forth between a couple of themes and theories, but this is kind of the general layout of what I'm going to be talking about. So first, and I kind of hinted at this, why study development economics? The central question of development economics is why are some countries rich and other countries poor? And this is something that from the very beginning of economics, Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations was really interested in this disparity of wealth among nations. And it's a really important question, a really good question that many, many economists and philosophers have asked and pondered over the years. So first, a couple of background measures. GDP, as we talked about before, or maybe we haven't, is gross domestic product, is the amount of goods and services a country produces in a year within the physical boundaries of the country. Uh, you compare GDP with GNI, or gross national income, which takes into account foreign ownership as well as domestic. So I have a pretty good example, at least I think it's a pretty good example right here. So if Toyota, a Japanese company, owns a factory in the United States and the factory produces cars, then the factory itself is considered American GDP because it's physically in the United States and not Japanese GDP because the factory is not in Japan. But conversely, the factory would be counted in Japanese GNI, um, but not American GNI because it's not an American company. So that kind of both are used very often in the field in research. And then there's another measure called the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of wealth inequality. And it's a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is completely unequal. In fact, 100 would mean that one person owns all the wealth in the country, and 0 would be perfectly equal. So, as economists, we don't want either extreme. We don't actually want perfect equality because then there will be no incentive for certain jobs and certain things. But we also don't want inequality either because there are certain economic and philosophical issues with that as well. So, not going to go too much into the Gini coefficient, but it's important for you to know because this you will hear about this in the research. So we have GDP, which and GNI, which really track production, and this is all well and good. However, um, other organizations such as the United Nations cares more about that. Do we really, first of all, it's good that we know how much a country is producing, but does that really reflect how the quality of life is? So there are other measurements, and these are kind of the most important ones. Infant mortality rate is a big one, literacy, life expectancy, unemployment, inflation. These are things that organizations like the United Nations really looks at as well as GDP to show or to discover how a country is doing. Also, a note about GDP and GNI, and this is something I didn't talk about in the previous slide, but I should just make a note. It's not terribly important, but what we actually care about is not really GDP, but GDP per capita, right? If the GDP of a country is, let's say, $1 million and 1 million people live there, well, that's actually not a particularly prosperous country. But if the same country has a GDP of 1 million people and only 10 people live there, that's actually a very prosperous country. So what you'll see as we talk about this is that actually it's really per capita or per person metrics that we actually care about. So here's the big $1 million question is how to increase wages. And we've already talked about this a little bit. So this is another kind of interpretation of that. And the theory is that for a firm to maximize profits, and to minimize waste or inefficiency, wages should equal marginal product of labor. What does that mean? Well, marginal product of labor is the profit that the firm will make with that additional worker. So the theory is that your wage should equal how much profit you bring to the company. Now, in the real world, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but there's a good place to start as a model of the economy. And what this says is that if a worker can produce more in an hour, then their marginal products would increase. The profit of the firm would increase, and that would actually increase wages. Now, this is very, very interesting, but in the research, this generally holds true. As productivity increases, wage does increase in general. Now, there are some caveats, but in general, this is true. So that's important to note, and hold on to that thought, and we'll get back to that. So let's talk about actually theories of economic prosperity. So now we know kind of how to increase wages. Let's talk about this. So we talked about labor productivity. It is higher, significantly higher in more developed countries than developing countries. There is also a significant investment in capital, and this is very important. The two are actually related. There's not a one-directional causality. Capital and productivity go both ways. So capital increases labor productivity, and labor productivity increases capital. So it is kind of a chicken and egg question, but really important. And so the two are very related. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more about social capital. So I'm mentioning it here. We'll go into a little bit more detail. So here's the flow. It starts with an increase in human capital and innovation. And what we mean by human capital, again, is kind of the education, training, life experiences of an individual. Those two things, human capital and innovation, will increase productivity, which increases wages. Wages increase savings, which increase investment, which increase capital, which increase productivity, which increases still higher wages, which leads to prosperity. So there's a lot going on here, but you can see, and I could even start instead of human capital, I could just put capital in the beginning and say capital will increase wages, will increase savings, etc. So there's a lot going on here. I know it's a lot to digest, but all these variables are very related. The key takeaway here is that invest in human capital, encourage savings, encourage investment, encourage innovation. All of these things will make a country more prosperous. And a lot of this is pretty common sense, but maybe you haven't thought of it this way, or you haven't seen this kind of diagram. And so it's good to think about it in this way. So again, there's a role of savings, investment, and education. They're all interconnected. But a brief recap of social capital. It includes resourcefulness, productivity, creativity, intelligence, inclusiveness in a group, things like education, training, community events. All of these things foster a sense of social or human capital. It's also important that culture is an important component of human capital as well, which is why I included inclusiveness as a group. So any kind of cultural, social, creative movements, organizations, anything that bring people together are also part of this social capital. And two ways that we can increase technology, again, we've talked about patent rights, and patent rights are crucial. They're so important for encouraging innovation and technology. Without patent rights, there becomes less of an incentive to innovate. Education and social capital also have a huge role in technological process. If you notice a theme here, there's a lot of these variables are correlated. So it's not just one that affects the other, but the other that affects that one. So yeah, education increases social capital. Social capital can increase the quality of education. Both increase technology, and technology increases both. They're all interconnected. And I put here property rights as an encouragement of investment. Also important to know, to have, a society that promotes justice and peace with also respect to property rights also goes a long way in encouraging both innovation and prosperity. And the last point, I think that's the last point. Yes, that is. Okay. The last point is free and equitable access to credit markets. And in a lot of research out there, it talks about this from a financial perspective, from an economic history perspective. The countries that have more equitable and fair access to lending institutions where people can borrow to make their dream come true, to start a business, to innovate, to create, have more prosperity. So this is a really important component also to remember. So that was a lot of information and kind of a lot of circular thinking, a lot of things interrelated, interconnected. So the key takeaways, if you want a prosperous nation, and these are the most important things, encourage investment and build capital stock by encouraging savings, encourage new ideas and innovation, create a just and equitable lending institutions, promote education. The last one, have a stable government. Some of these might seem common sense, and you could actually go into much more detail about how or why certain countries don't have these as well as other countries. A lot of research out there, and this is just kind of scratching the surface. There's a lot more that could be said about development economics, but these are kind of the key ideas that give you a good background of the study of development economics.